Hi, Grant.
Hello.
I fucking hate this thing.
Whoa, what is your camera quality is so like
Fucking terrible. Just
it's so
say it.
heavily contrasted.
Fucking awful.
What's your camera?
My camera is the webcam that I bought. Hold on, I need to send an email to Scott. I hate. Oh, admit. Look at all these people coming in.
Oh, Michael, I splurged and I got the Super Mario collection on Switch.
Oh, did you buy it
I'm playing
physically or
Galaxy
digitally?
right
Did
now. Huh?
you buy it physically or digitally?
They have physically?
Yeah,
Oh, I didn't know that. I bought it digitally.
admit.
Yeah, yeah, I'm playing Galaxy right now.
Oh, I just finished Sunshine.
I gotta play that next.
Hi, Eve. Sorry.
No, you're all good.
I'm so sorry. This thing, I am not an expert at using Zoom. So I need to send an email to Scott and say, Scott, I killed the other room. If any of your students need new Zoom room. Hey, Scott, my Zoom room died for whatever reason. So if any of your students I'm totally gonna lose it, guys. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, hello.
Sorry, you're just gonna have to give me 1 second. But we are making our way downtown. Walking fast, paces fast, and I'm homebound.
Is this a part of the thesis editing class, Michael?
This is me just going over some post stuff with Eve.
Very sweet.
Okay. There should be another Michael here, and I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to start my broadcast. Please work. Can you guys see my screen?
No.
No.
Nope, you can't. Because leave and join, yes. Without video.
Is anyone else coming? I know like Brendan messaged in the chat, like, or was it? I think it was Grant, right? It was just Grant.
Yeah. I didn't know about this. I just came last minute.
Oh, nice. Welcome.
Happy to be here. Is that an octopus on a jug in that painting behind you?
Me?
No, Melissa.
Gonna be like,
Oh,
what the
which
fuck
one?
wrong?
In the middle.
All right, can you all see my screen?
Your head. It looks
Yeah.
like an octopus. So that's like on like a little vase.
Oh no, those are flowers my mom painted, but that works too.
You were
All
covering
right.
all of them, and I only saw the one on the far right. So it's like a little mini like squid just chilling.
Okay, let's get back to this. Okay, so basically what I was explaining was in the old days, you had film. I yeah, just go. I'm not. I said earlier I'm not a professor, right? So I don't know everything. So if I say something wrong, I'm a student just like everybody else. But this is just what I've picked up on. But part of teaching a lot of modern post is teaching historical post as well. So just because some of these things just keep coming back. So we're talking about film. Okay, so you have this emulsion, and so when light strikes this emulsion, right, depending on the intensity of the light, it burns an image into the film, right? And it creates these things that are called halide crystals, and this emulsion is normally what's called referred to as silver halide, which you don't need to know. But basically, suffice to say, it is a chemical compound that, when exposed to light, can burn an image, like an impression of what it's seeing, onto that film. And we do that obviously through a variety of different ways with lenses and filters and all these things to concentrate the light. But this is the basic principle of how film works, right? Depending on the severity and the intensity of light is going to be the severity and intensity of that specific spot on your image. So if I expose film to Grant, right, Grant has a dark shirt on, and so there's not that much light that's reflecting off of his shirt. So in terms of actually burning an image into the film, you're not going to burn much of an image in that area, right? It's going to be lack of burning, and that's going to create this impression of a dark spot, of a dark shirt, versus, I can see that there is a highlight in the background of Grant's image, right? Whereas that highlight would burn more intently and create the white of a black and white film, right? And so this is how we get a black and white image. Now, this black and white, in general, will be referred to throughout film and then also referred to in modern day as luma. And in modern days, we would call this a luma layer. But luma is basically a black and white interpretation of your image. It's how bright and how dark something is. Now, the Technicolor process, the tricolor process, the idea of combining colors to make other colors was a very well-known thing in 1950, 1940, 1930, whatever, whenever black and white film was prevalent, right? But actually getting it working took quite a bit of effort. So it would take, obviously a little bit of years, and I'm glossing over a lot of technical details, but eventually, we reach an era in which we're going to take this same idea, the same principle of taking this emulsion and taking this luma layer, but on top of that, we're going to layer in 3 other layers of film. We're basically going to dye a layer red, we're going to dye a layer green, and we're going to dye a layer blue, right? So film still looks like this, right? It still looks like that. It's just now on its side profile, there's 4 different layers of actual celluloid that's being operated on here. And the basic principle is there is a wavelength of color, right? There is a wavelength of color. Let's see if I can find a better one. Yeah. So you'll see here, like, color and light in general exists on a spectrum, right? And visible light is only a tiny part of that spectrum. But when you talk about, I think I actually have my colors backwards in my film, but basically you're talking about less strong light or you're talking about strong light to weak light, right? So X-rays, gamma rays, ultraviolet, these are stronger forms of light versus radio waves and infrared, which are a weaker form of light, right? So basically what the basic principle behind this is, no, I do have this right. Basically, the principle behind this is the stronger your light, the more layers you're going to penetrate in this celluloid, right? Because blue is the strongest, only blue light gets down this far, only green light gets down this far, and only red light gets down this far, right? And so basically what you're doing is you're taking an image fed into the celluloid and you're breaking it into its 3 component parts: a red channel, or what we call a red layer, a green layer, and a blue layer. Now, in modern times, we call these things channels, right? So you have a red channel, a green channel, a blue channel. And I don't think they call it a luma channel, but I still think they call it a luma layer. But you're basically breaking these base components down, right? And what you end up getting is a Technicolor image. And the word Technicolor actually comes from the company Technicolor, which is still around today. But Technicolor are the people who really pioneered this process and got it off and running. Now, Eve, you and I have talked about this, but my personal belief is being very knowledgeable about color grading is in many ways being very knowledgeable about post-production in general, right? So I'm going to talk so to everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about color, and color grading goes hand in hand with all of this. Um, so what ends up happening is in the old days, you didn't really have this opportunity to color grade like you do now, right? Where we can manipulate how we want colors, and we can say, okay, well, I want this type of what I want to get this type of vibe or feel or whatever, right? In the old days, the way that you did color grading was you had two options, and the first and most important one was what film stock you chose. Now I've simplified this process to say that there's this red layer, this green layer, and this blue layer. But in reality, you can manipulate this formula in so many different ways that every single way that you manufacture film could look different from one another. Does that make sense? So basically, suffice to say, if I'm Kodak, I want my film to have some type of specialized look. So I'm really going to beef up my green layer, right? My green layer is going to be really, really tough. And it gives Kodak this very specific type of look. Meanwhile, Canon is saying, well, we want ours to have a really strong red layer and a medium strength blue layer, but not so strong on the green. And it creates all these different types of looks. So if you go back and you look at old interviews of directors, they're constantly arguing about which film stock is the best. Oh, I want to use Kodak 8500K or whatever. Oh, I use Canon's whatever. The way that you chose a look largely depended on what type of film stock you chose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Melissa Grant.
Yes.
Okay. Just tell me if I go too quickly or I'm not talking about anything that makes sense. The other option that you had was during the development process of film, you could do what was called color timing. So actually developing film is something that I totally don't understand. But suffice to say, you have to expose negatives, which is this celluloid that you're burning in. You need to expose it in a way to actually develop film that you go and cut on, right? And in the old days, when you developed film, you could flash that film with a red light. Boop, 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 boop. You could flash it with a green light, or you could flash it with a blue light. And depending on how you flashed it and how long you flashed it, you could also kind of recolor your film. And so this was called color timing. And it's important to note that this is called color timing because lots of old people still use this term to refer to color grading.
And that's using colored light, like on set?
Like in a red room, when you're developing your film, you would flash it with red lights, green lights, and blue lights. And it was literally like a switchboard that had a little red lever, a little green lever, and a little blue lever. And depending on how long you flashed it for, you got different time. You got different color. So how much time you spent changed the color, i.e., color timing.
Gotcha. Oh, sorry.
Right.
I take it right back.
Go for it. This is color timing. And this is kind of the principle of where modern color grading comes from. This comes from this like basic idea of color timing. But we'll get to that later. So after you've developed the film, like we were talking about earlier, Eve, once you develop the film and you synced it up with audio, you'd have, basically this reel of film that had the actual footage on it. And then along the side of it, it had this like little magnetic scratch tape. And this was the audio. And so you would deliver this to the editors and the producers and the director the day after it was shot, right? And so this is where you get the name dailies, because they were delivered the next day, right? And so this is where we get the principle of dailies. Now, another important term is this whole process of actually getting film developed cost a lot of money, right? Film as a principle cost a lot of money. which is why one of the things that I think is glossed over in film history, which I think is a shame, is the social justice that came from the era of digital actually enabled filmmakers of all shapes, races, ethnicities, and genders to make film affordably, which opened up the film market to everyone. In the old days, film was this closely guarded industry held by rich white guys because it cost a lot of money to not only shoot a film but develop it and everything. So the keys to that kingdom were very tightly held, right? So you have to remember all of this stuff costs money, right? It's a lot of money to do any of this stuff. So even getting dailies made cost a lot of money. So one of the things that was really important for a script supervisor to do, and it's still a holdover from the old days, was this idea of a print take, right? And so if a director ever says print that, or a script supervisor says, what do you want to print? The term where that comes from is the old days of dailies cost so much money to develop, there was no use in developing a bad take, right? If there was a bad take, you just didn't even bother developing it in a red room and handing it over to the editor, right? And so a script supervisor would mark what takes needed to be printed and what takes shouldn't be printed to save money. Now in the modern days, we call these print takes, just for a director on set basically to remember which takes were his or her favorite. All that makes sense?
Yes, yeah.
We're vibing. So how edit, a lot of some editing professors will tell you how films were edited in the old days were important. They're not really that. It's not really that important. But basically, suffice to say, you took these dailies, right? And then as the editor, you physically snipped it and taped it to another daily. That's it. How you did that was many a debate, and there was the Moviola, and there was all these other editing machines that you cut tape on, but it's really not that important. Honest to God, it's not that important. But it's important to know that this, I guess it is important to know the old way in which that this was done, and I'll talk about this later, but the old ways in which film and Hollywood and post-production were done influence everything in the modern day. Right? We'll talk about that in a bit, though. Okay, so that's kind of the old way of doing film. Am I missing anything? I don't think so. Okay, we're going to talk about modern post now, which is exciting. Now, there's two films that really matter here. I hold them very dear to my heart. There's a film released in 2000. Any ideas? One of, probably, I would argue, the most important film released in the last 50 years. Genuinely, the most important movie released in the last 50 years. What do you think it is?
Are you talking about color and?
I'm talking about, there's two films I'm talking about. But the second one is important, and it's really important. But the first one is the most important. Any idea?
No Country for Old Men.
No.
No.
Narrative hippy dippies. I ain't talking about narrative. I'm talking about real important shit here.
I just got back to the conversation. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
The most important film released in the last 50 years is. The first Star Wars prequel. One of the worst films ever released. But genuinely one of the most important. Why? Because The Phantom Menace was the first commercial production to use digital. This is the first Hollywood movie to shoot on a digital sensor, to make digital footage, to do everything digitally.
I thought No Country for Old Men was. Was it not?
When was No Country for Old Men released?
It might have been after. The reason why I said that, I thought that was the first digital film.
No Country for Old Men was 2007.
Never mind. I don't know why I thought that.
No, yeah, it's The Phantom Menace from my understanding. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but this is what I've been telling everybody for a while now.
You're right.
So, now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it's important to know that this is where the world is going. And this is the world that we find ourselves in today are films that are shot on digital, edited digitally, and released digitally, with film nowhere in this process. Now, people like Quentin Tarantino will tell you that if your film's not shot on film, you're not a real filmmaker, but Quentin Tarantino can go fuck himself, right? In modern days, this is how films are done, right? Shot digitally, edited digitally, released digitally. Now, I'm going to back up a tiny bit because it is important to realize that um, this isn't necessarily the case. So I don't remember when. So the world of editorial, the world of film is this, right? You're going to film school and you're working in the film industry to learn how to load film, how to cut on physical film, how to develop film in a red room. Like these are apprenticeships that take a long time to learn, done on really expensive equipment with really expensive. I can't emphasize how expensive all this shit is, right? Like this is where you get into the idea of paying your dues, working as an apprentice, having mentors. Like this is where this idea comes from, is because all of this shit's really fucking expensive, so you can't fuck up. And this equipment is very specific. It's all of it's hand built, like, and it's old, right? It's this kind of like tried and true way of doing stuff. So the world doesn't really have its first, I kind of say like technological shakeup in terms of post production until the invention of the Avid One. And this is unimportant, but Steve Jobs was a brilliant man. So this was an Apple II. This is my illustration of an Apple II. And the Apple II was the first commercially available Apple or PC. There was the Apple One, and the Apple One did a lot of cool stuff, but it didn't have what we call like an interface, where a GUI, a graphics user interface, which was basically a visual way of telling your computer how to do stuff. When you look at your screen right now and you see buttons and icons and a desktop screen, this is a GUI, is what you're looking at. So the Apple II is the first computer to have a GUI. Now that's not really that important, except for the fact that the Apple II was a hacker's like dream computer. It was this device that like you could buy relatively easily commercially, and then you could mess around with, change out components, fuck with, right? Now Steve Jobs hated that, and he would never let anybody do that again with like the Mac, right? But the Apple II was pioneered by Steve Wozniak, who's this huge hacker guy. So a group of guys gets together and they say, why don't we hack this Apple II to make it so that you can take film, right? Scan it digitally and then edit digitally. So they basically take these Apple IIs and they hack them into things that look exactly like Apple IIs, but with some accessories that allow you to edit film on them. And they develop this very rudimentary software. And this is called the Avid One. Now, this is important to note because some people always wonder why people call it the Avid. I'm going to go edit on the Avid, right? But it's just a computer. This is where this term comes from. Because you actually physically bought a product called the Avid One, right? And you edited on a physical product called an Avid. It was an Apple II, but it didn't work like an Apple II. You couldn't access the regular Apple II stuff. It was an Avid, right? So that's where this term comes from, is this idea of I'm going to go edit on the Avid. And this is the start of digital production. So what ends up happening is editors are taking their film, they're scanning all of the negatives digitally, right? And then they're putting that into the Avid One system so that they can actually edit with them. And once they've edited it out, what you can do is you can print out this sheet, which you can print out this like big ticker tape sheet, right? That has a list of all of the edits that you've made. So in the old days, an editor would cut on the dailies, and then some poor schmuck would need to take the dailies, actually go back into a red room, right? Pull out all the negatives that were shot on set and cut the negatives to match what the editor had done. And this is, and for the other people, Evie won't know this term, but this is kind of like the first conform, right? is you have this poor guy who's got to sit in this dark room and rebuild a film that an editor has done, but from the actual camera daily, from the camera negatives. Right? Does all that make sense? Okay.
Hey Michael, just to confirm, so they would like re-edit it based off of the printed list of
Yeah,
from the Avid
exactly.
one. Okay, cool.
So this process of you would cut these physical dailies on like a machine, right? Or you like on a moviola, like you would cut with scissors, tape things together. This is how you edited in the old days. You'd have this whole movie, but it was cut on dailies, and dailies were like cheap, shitty celluloid, right? So then I would take this whole thing that I've made, I'd hand it to some poor intern, and he'd have to go into this dark room, go back to the original camera media, like the negatives that were shot on set, and then recut everything that I had done, but on those negatives. So it was like a manual relinking in a way of the actual camera negatives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, gotcha. Poor guy.
Like a
Yeah.
physical ALE.
Yeah, that job sucked. So the way that we accelerate and so all the dailies also had like numbers on it. There was a whole numbering system for knowing which dailies came from which negatives and all these things. So, they could look at the numbers and be like, okay, it's frame 18 of reel 27, right? And then they'd go and find frame 18 of reel 27 of the negatives and then cut it. So now we're just going to print out a big list that has all the edits on it. But it's the same principle. I then still have to hand this paper list to some guy who then's going to take that paper list, go into a red room, and do the exact same thing that he was doing before. But instead of having to use the dailies that I've cut out, I can just use the big sheet that he's printed out for me. Now, does anybody have any idea what this kind of becomes?
ALEs and like XMLs and stuff.
Exactly. This process later will become the EDL, the XLE, the AAF. Yeah, those are the big ones. And we'll talk about those in a sec, Eve. You'll know what those are. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about those in a sec. So this is how the process has now starts to go on for like the next 20-odd years after the Avid one is released. People are still shooting physically. They're still shooting on tape, on film. They're scanning it digitally. They're sending it to the Avid one. They're cutting on the Avid one. They're printing out this thing, this piece of paper, which I literally do think is actually called an editing decision list. And Eve, that's where you get the term EDL. We'll talk about that in a sec, though. Right? So so this is how the process goes on for a really long time. Right? This kind of becomes the new modern post process. It is also during this era that we invent what's called the DI process, right? Because now that we've gone to the Avid one, other things start to come out. Tron comes out and people are doing computer-generated imagery. Jurassic Park comes out and people are doing compositing. Like these VFX things start happening, right? So more and more stuff is entering the computer space. So once we've entered the computer space, the digital space, they start to call everything, the moment you've entered a computer, they start to call that the DI process. Or the digital intermediary process. Now the DI, when I say, oh, I need to send this film off to DI, that has a different connotation today than it did 30 years ago. But we'll talk about that in a sec. But it seems to be you need to basically understand that like the idea of the digital intermediary process is born, that we're going to start taking this physical film and running it through computers to do different things. And the digital intermediary process only starts to grow to take over all aspects of production. It starts out very small, and it's basically people start to say, what else can we replace on a film set with a computer? Right? Parker's here. Admit. Um, so this is kind of what's going on. Hi, Parker. Um,
Hi.
I'm just gonna keep going. Just if you don't understand something. Oh yeah, if anyone has any questions, just write. You can either write them down or just ask me. By the way. Um, all right. So this is the DI process. Where the fuck am I? I'm gonna skip ahead to 2007. Can you look up when Oh Brother Where Art Thou was released, Grant?
That was the film I was trying to think of. The first digitally colored film, right?
Yes.
That's what I was trying to say earlier. 2000.
2000. Okay, so we're gonna jump ahead 1 year after the Phantom Menace. The Phantom Menace is doing this new thing with digital cameras, but we do not know yet that that will be a revolution. Here is another revolution a year later, which is Oh Brother Where Art Thou. So I've told you, people are scanning film, editing on Avid, sending it back to this poor guy in a room, and then that guy might color time some stuff based on the director's choices and all these things before we go to print. Print is, sending it off to theaters and distributors and whatnot. Now, uh, the Coen brothers are approached with this movie that they want to make called Oh Brother Where Art Thou. If you have not seen this movie, it's one of my favorite movies. It's genuinely a good movie. Really good. You should go watch it. Have you seen it? Anyone seen it?
I've seen it. Yeah.
Has everyone seen it? Oh, Melissa, you got to go watch Oh Brother Where Art Thou.
I know.
Parker, have you seen Oh Brother Where Art Thou?
I have not.
Okay. The content of Oh Brother Where Art Thou is unimportant, except for one fact. The film is set in the Mississippi Dust Bowl. Yeah, the Mississippi Dust Bowl in 1920. Right? That's when the film is set. It's set in like Depression era Mississippi in the middle of the Dust Bowl. So it's supposed to be dry and bland. And it's also supposed to be, it's an allegory for Homer's Odyssey, but set in 1920s America. So it's supposed to be kind of this like storybook feel. So suffice to say, it's supposed to feel like the frames you're looking at are pages of a book. It's kind of was like this stylistic idea. Now, the guy who shot this film, Roger Deakins, is so incredibly famous in the world of cinematography, and he gets a lot of praise for his other things, but this is the most important thing Roger Deakins has ever done in his life. This is just like historically, film historians will look at this as the most important thing Roger Deakins has done in his life. And he should have won the Oscar, and he didn't win the Oscar, so the Academy can go fuck themselves. Like, this is the most important thing this guy has done, which is basically there is this new technology that some companies have developed, and they've developed it, and they've not developed it for film. They've developed it for advertising, short films, music videos. And basically, instead of just scanning these dailies, and you kind of scan them in the shitty way, instead of scanning these dailies in this shitty way, I'm sorry, I'm explaining this really badly. Okay, so there's this new, okay, I'm just going to jump into it. There's this new invention on the horizon, and it's being pioneered by people at Technicolor and Photochem and these other companies. And it's called color grading. And the basic principle behind color grading is instead of scanning your dailies at a shitty resolution, what if we scan them at the highest resolution that we possibly could? Right? And we scan it at the highest resolution that we possibly could. And then what if we wanted to tweak stuff in the image? And at the beginning, it was very rudimentary. It was like, I want to turn their hat green. I want their tie to be blue. I want the sky to be darker. Like very basic rudimentary color adjustments, right? So what if we want to do this stuff and we want to do it to the entire film? Now, scanning stuff at such a high resolution took a lot of data storage, and we take data storage for granted today, right? Like, I've got like 4 terabytes sitting on my desk, right? But like, huge data centers had to be built to store 500 megabits of data, right? So the idea of scanning stuff at this super high resolution and then doing this color grading on it with this very rudimentary software only worked for advertisements, music videos, and like short projects. Just physically on the amount of data that it took to scan this stuff. So Roger Deakins hears about color grading, and it's going on for a couple years, and they're doing it on advertisements, and they're doing it stuff like this because and here's the other important part of this whole color grading process: you have to reprint the film at the end of this, right? You have to physically print new film when you're done with color grading. So not only are you modifying stuff, like you need to go out and print new celluloid for the whole thing, right? So this is why you have to scan it at such a high resolution. Like you're not just gonna like work with some media and then go back to the original media. You literally are like creating new media, and it needs to be just as good as what you shot. So this whole process is a fucking headache for like a 30-second ad. But Roger Deakins finds out about this color grading, and the problem that he runs into with Oh Brother Where Art Thou is it's this old storybook feel of a movie. But the problem is they're shooting it in the summer of 1999 or 1998 in Mississippi or in Louisiana, something like that. And if you've ever, no, they're in Kansas. I think they're in Kansas. I think they shot the film in Kansas. If you've ever been to Kansas in the summer, you'll know it's greener than Oz, right? There's green everywhere. It looks like a jungle, right? Everything's green. So how the fuck are you supposed to sell this film as the Dust Bowl if everything's green? And they hated sepia filters like they were using on old westerns. They thought they looked terrible. So, and the studio won't move the film anywhere else. The studio won't give them any more money. So they kind of need to figure out what the fuck to do. So they approach Photo Camera Technicolor, I don't remember who, and they say, hey, this process you're doing for advertisements, we want to do it on our feature film. Now, anybody else in the world would say, go fuck yourself. This thing barely works for Audi commercials. You think we're going to get this working on your movie. But this is Roger Deakins and the Coen brothers. These are, these are Martin Scorsese level people. These are, you don't turn these people down. You don't say no to the Coen brothers. So they say, we'll try. And it's this whole massive undertaking to color grade Oh Brother Where Art Thou. And there's a documentary on this. It's such a big deal. You can go watch this documentary. But suffice to say, they accomplished their task, and it's this huge undertaking. But Oh Brother Where Art Thou is the first digitally colored film. Now, in modern reference, when somebody says DI, more often than not, they're referring to color grading, right? Like color grading has took on DI, although some people will use DI in its proper context. But sometimes if you'll hear somebody say, we need to really get this over to DI, guys, right? Like this is taking way too long. This needs to go to DI tomorrow. They're normally saying this needs to go to color. Okay. That's a lot of history. We haven't talked about anything modern. We're getting there, I promise. Any questions so far? Everybody following along with my story? It's very exciting. I'm sure it's thrilling to hear me just drone on and on and on. Parker, thank you for the thumbs up. Okay. We're going to turn back the hands of time a year to The Phantom Menace. So The Phantom Menace shoots their film on digital. And a couple years later, more and more films start to shoot their film on digital for quite a variety of reasons. But, and there's all these really fun things to talk about with the history of digital cinema. There's a really great documentary about the rise of digital cinema, which you can also go watch. I'm not going to talk about that because it's not that important. But suffice to say, the only important thing that you really need to garner from that is modern cameras look the way they do because they were mimicking the cameras of old. I'm going to pause that there because I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that statement means in a second here. But we talked about celluloid and how celluloid works, and it's exposed to light, and it's this chemical reaction, and it creates film and all that stuff, right? Okay, I just realized a little bit more, not history, but biology that we have to talk about. We need to talk about your eyeball. Grant knows about this because he watched a YouTube video about it, and he showed me this YouTube video that I'm going to send all of you to watch after this. It's the most important YouTube video you'll watch. But we're going to talk about eyeballs really quick. So in your eyeball is made up of two parts. Does anybody know what the two parts are? It's not Grant. Cool. Grant, what are the two parts?
The cornea and the iris, I think, right?
No. Come on, Grant. Behind the eyeball.
I don't know. The cones.
Yes.
Yeah, the cones.
So your eyeball, this is my terrible eye. That's horrifying. Yeah, terrifying. So your eyeball has two parts to it. Right? You have in your eye, you have things that are called cones and things that are called rods. What do cones register, Grant?
Color.
Color. What do rods register?
That's like light.
Yeah. So you can remember cones register color because C equals C. Cones color. And then rods, you'll just have to remember that's light. But what's really important to know is which of these two is more important biologically. As a human being, an animal, right? We're mammals. What's more important? Anybody?
The rods.
The rods. Because what's more important? The color of the tiger that's jumping out at you, or the fact that there's a fucking tiger, right? So cones are terrible, right? Cones are shitty, malformed, garbage pieces of shit, right? And I can say this because what color is the dress, guys? Is it black and blue or is it white and gold? We'll all argue about it forever, right? What color is whatever? There's so many colorblind, like it's not that common in women, but it's much more common in men. It's like 1 in 10 men are colorblind, right? Color is fucking terrible. We all fucking suck when it comes to color. And there's just no getting around this, right? We all have terrible cones, and we don't have that many cones in our eye. What we're all really good at, assuming you're not blind, is rods. Everyone's got good rods, right? We can all probably look at the corner of a room, and if we could somehow gauge on how dark and how bright that color is, or how dark or how like somehow we could gauge this, we probably all agree on how dark a corner is, on how dark a room is, right? We could all probably agree on this, but on what color the dress is, we may never agree, right? So it's important to know that kind of going off is that like light information and how dark and how bright something is really, really matters to us as human beings, right? But we'll come back to that in a second. I promise. I know I'm like, we'll come back to that. We'll come back, but like I'm going something where we're all of this. So behind your eye, you have 3 types of cones. I need to look up a photo of this. Short, medium, long cones. Can I spell? Okay, so in your eye, you have 3 cones. You have a cone. Just go with me here. I'm looking at a graph in front of me. So in your eyeball, you have 3 types of cones. You have a cone here. Probably shouldn't do this in white. Let's do it in black. Can you see that? Yeah. Good luck. That's a short cone. So you have 3 cones here. You have what's referred to as a short cone, a medium cone, and a long cone. If you Google short, medium, long cones into Google, you'll see what I'm talking about. But colloquially, we know these as a blue cone, that's supposed to be there. I've totally butchered this. I'm so sorry. This illustration is absolutely fucking terrible. So please look this up to see what I'm talking about. And a red cone. If you look up short, medium, long cones, you'll see the exact. Is everyone looking at this image? Yes.
I'm looking at one right now. Here,
Okay, good.
I can post it in the.
Yeah, I'm a terrible illustration here. But basically what ends up happening is short, medium, long refer to the wavelength of the light. So a short wavelength, a medium wavelength, and a long wavelength. And it is actually the intersection of these cones that give us color perception. So a cone by itself cannot tell us what a color is. It's at the intersections of cones, right? So it is at this intersection here that we can see green. It is at this intersection here that we can see yellow, this intersection where we see orange, this intersection where we see red. It's the intersection of these cones that actually give us the perception of color. So when you're missing a cone, that's how you get color blindness, right? Or if you have a cone deficiency, so you have a weak cone, or you have a cone that's been shifted, or anything like that, this is how you get all these various issues of color blindness. If you're missing all of your cones, you see in black and white. Now, there's very little people in history who have been known to be missing all their cones, but it is possible, right? So I talked about this. So this is how your eyeballs work, right? You have rods, and then you have these cones. So you can think of it as you have 4 parts of your eye. You have a light measuring part of your eye, you have a red measuring part of your eye, you have a green measuring part of your eye, and you have a blue measuring part of your eye. Is this familiar at all to anyone? This is the principle of where we get Technicolor film from, right? We're taking the same principle of how we as humans see, and we're building that into our celluloid. Does that make sense? It's kind of fucking crazy, right? But we can take it a step further. Let's say you're some crazy fucking scientist and you want to capture images digitally. Well, how do you do this? We kind of think of, a lot of people will think of digital cameras as like, it's some engineer's shit. It's not important to me. But how this shit works is actually, I think, very fundamental to modern post-production and just filmmaking in general. So how do we actually do this? How do we get a camera sensor to make a digital image? Any ideas? I'm asking a huge engineering question, so I don't expect anyone, but any ideas? Does anybody know? It's crazy.
No.
Okay, well, but I'm gonna blow your mind. So we have a thing called a CMOS sensor. This is unimportant. This is electrical engineering stuff, but it's important because you'll hear this term again. There's something called a CMOS sensor. And a CMOS sensor is kind of the intersection of chemical engineering and electrical engineering, which is basically, suffice to say, you create this little photosite that is this chemical that can output electrical signals based on how much light is hitting it. So the stronger the light, the stronger the signal that comes from this little piece of the stronger the electrical signal that comes from this little piece of chemical. And then you have this tiny little you have this tiny little box underneath it that registers the strength of that electrical signal coming from the chemical. Okay? And this is a sensor. So now we can register light, right? We can register the intensity of light. So the stronger the electrical signal that's coming from the chemical, the stronger the light. Yes, Grant?
Is that all related to like solar panels and how they work?
I have no clue. Maybe. I'm sure there's some relation somewhere. CMOS is a very like CMOS is a foundational building block of logic design in circuit boards, but that's unimportant. But so you can kind of get this. We now have a way to register light, and so these type of sensors are used on everything, right? To just register the intensity of light and to look at stuff. Now, here's a tricky idea. What if we? How do I copy? I don't know how to do anything fun in this application. Copy,
iPad.
paste. Look at that. Here's a crazy idea, guys. What if we take this little chemical that we've got going on here, right? What if we dyed it green? And what if we took two more? Oh, shit. Look at my roommate chat. What if we took two more and we dyed them, one of them blue? And what would we dye the other one?
Red.
Red. Well, guys, now we have a way to measure a light coming in, the intensity of that light. And because they're red, green, and blue, we can measure the intensity of red, green, and blue light. Crazy shit. Is everyone following along with what I'm saying? Sometimes I can lose people here at the electrical engineering part. But everyone following what I'm saying so far? Okay. How does this work? So what ends up happening is a guy named Bayer takes this principal idea of what we've got going on over here, and he lays out all of these little photo sites in what he calls the Bayer pattern, right? And he lays them out in this very specific way, right? Where basically, if you look at all of those squares, what color is represented more there than all of the other colors?
Green.
Green. Now, he does this to mimic the amount of cones you actually have in your head, right? And the strength of those cones. So by far, the most amount of cones you have in your head and the strongest cones that you have in your head are green, right? Your green cones represent about, I think it's like 55% of the cones in your head. And then red and blue is the weakest. I think red takes up like 30, something like that. I'm totally pulling these numbers out of my ass, but I'm in the ballpark, right? So then this would be like 15. So basically, what we're trying to do is we want to lay out a mathematical repetitive pattern of creating camera sensors, but we want to do it in a way that mimics the human eye as closely as possible. So this pattern that he creates, Bayer, as close to as possible, tries to match these numbers, right? Am I making sense? So the amount of green sites on here is about 55%. The amount of red actually ends up being about 25%, and the amount of blue ends up being about 25%. But it's about as close as you can get with a repetitive mathematical pattern that you need like this, right, to build these sensors. So this is the invention of the modern digital sensor. Oh, there's so much more to go through. All right, guys, got to kick it in overdrive. We got more ground to cover. Um, okay, so this is the modern digital sensor. Now, digital sensors are obviously are around a lot earlier than the Phantom Menace. It's just digital sensors don't get good enough for cinema quality, really, until the Phantom Menace. Now, there's a lot that happens, but the reason I'm talking about Oh Brother Where Art Thou and then I'm talking about Phantom Menace is in an unexpected way, they become married, right? These seem like two separate post topics that I'm talking about, which is color grading and digital sensors and editorial and whatever. And it's almost like everyone's playing in their own camp until all of a sudden, boom, they just merge. And it becomes this like conglomeration of modern post that it's really hard to separate any of it from one another. So this is what I mean. Film, good old film. Does everybody understand what that illustration is? I've totally given up on drawing. Film is, fill in the word,
Beautiful.
beautiful. We can all agree, right? Is anybody here going to argue that film is not beautiful? Like, film is gorgeous. Shoot something on film, looks fucking great, right? Come on, right? That's a digital image. That looks like film, right? That's also shot on digital. Where's the film photos? Come on. Give me some good film photos. Yeah, it looks like film. Right? Film just looks good. Right, guys? We can all agree. Film looks fucking great. Looks fucking beautiful. And it may sound very hippy dippy of me, but film is a physical, chemical, quote unquote, natural process that recreates really organic colors. Right? We get really good gradients. We get really beautiful popping colors. We get what you see is what you get. Like, film is very hippy dippy granola crunch in nature, right? Like it is, it's very natural. Digital, a camera sensor filled with its boxes of sensors is, give it to me,
Ugly.
ugly. Shit's ugly. There's no way getting around it. My iPhone camera does not look as good as a film stock Canon camera. It doesn't. It's never going to. I mean, fucking Polaroids look good. Polaroids are shot on like the cheapest fucking garbage celluloid you can buy, right? And they look good, right? Like film just looks good. Digital does not look good. Now, this is a problem. Digital sensors and digital movies are. So I guess, okay, here's what people would say to me then. Michael, why would we ever shoot on digital then? It's more complicated. People don't know how to use it, and it's ugly. So what is the big thing about digital? Eve, I was driving it home earlier.
The cheapness.
Cheap. Cheap. Digital is cheap. No way getting around it. Shooting a 10-minute scene on physical film costs $6,000 on 35 millimeter film. Like 35, yeah, like $6,000, something like that. How much does it cost to shoot a 10-minute scene on digital?
It's free.
It's free. I buy the camera, it's free, right? The benefits of digital are so great. You mess up a take, it doesn't cost money, right? The light, you know, it's there's money. Digital is better for money, right? In just every sense of the word, digital is better for money. It's more environmentally friendly. I don't know. Who gives a shit? Money, right? Like money rules the world, right? Digital is cheap. So, the engineers at in the camera field know that they can strike gold not only in the cinema market but in the every market if they can get digital cameras looking better, right? And really, the entry point to all of this is going to be film. They need to make film cameras look better. So, how do we do that? Right? Well, the simplest answer is we need to insert a person here in kind of a anti-engineering sensibility. Instead of taking away human people and human input, we want to add human input. So when a camera sensor records light, it can't help but record light linearly. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say I could chart the brightness of things on a scale from 0, which is the absence of light, to 100, which is very, very bright, right? The brightest that my eyeball could actually comprehend, right? And let's say this line represents the level of a discrimination that a camera uses when discerning between that light, which is, suffice to say, none. A digital sensor, when left unaltered, records light as it was sent into its sensor. Suffice to say, if I shoot an object, if it's dark, I'm going to register it as dark, and if it's bright, I'm going to register it as bright. I'm going to give you what I'm seeing. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what ends up happening is you get really ugly images with this process, right? You get really just kind of shit images. What ends up happening in between a camera sensor and when you get a file from that camera sensor is, remember how I was telling you that this stuff is registering electrical voltage, right? So basically, a camera sensor, all it does is it reads the voltage from all of the different photo sites. But then, okay, let's say, I'm going to come back to this in a second here. So if I have a camera sensor, it's going to read out, those are supposed to be thunderbolts, right? It needs to read all of this electrical data and turn it into an image, right? So it feeds this into a processing unit, right? A computer. I'm just going to call it a computer. It feeds this into a computer, and the computer generates the image, right? This process here is called debayering, which is a term you will hear. Debayering. And we get the word debayer because, like I said, the guy who made this earlier, his name was Bayer. This is called the Bayer pattern, right? And he was like a pioneer of camera sensors. So we are debayering. So basically, we're taking electrical data from right here, and we're turning it into an image, right? That makes sense? Now, debayering, when left to just work with linear data, equals ugly, right? So you have two options here as a filmmaker. And I think a lot of you are going to go, oh, because this is where this comes from. How many of you have taken calculus? Parker? Can't see your camera. Any calculus? Yes. Melissa, no calculus? Did you take trig? Or stats? Okay, you'll know about this then too. So in math, I know you're all being like, oh my God, Michael's about to start talking about math. I'm going to lose it. I promise I'm going somewhere. What is this line called relationshiply? What type of line is it?
Linear, right?
Linear. Right? What you see is what you get. 0 to 100. We're gonna capture it. And then we're gonna debayer it. Now, what if instead of capturing this linearly, we captured it like that? Anybody know what that relationship is called?
Exponential?
Exponential is this.
Oh, never mind.
It's kind of the opposite of exponential. I know you all know what this is.
Like the ln or whatever. No.
Yes, it has a relationship to ln.
Logarithmic.
Logarithmic. Ever wondered where you get the term log film from? We're going to go shoot in log. C log, S log, red log film. Do I hear any O's in the crowd?
Ah.
You know what I'm talking about, Grant. You know what log film is. Melissa,
Yeah.
you know what log film is, right?
Michael, I feel like you're overestimating how smart we all are.
No, I know you all. Okay, all right. Hold on. Parker, do you know what log film is?
Sorry, I'm making breakfast.
No, you're totally good. I'm going to throw this in my presentation here. Come on. Oh, add. So this is log film. Now, what is the difference between log film and linear film? While linear film treats everything equally, log film discriminates. Now, it discriminates on the basis of light. And so basically, if something is darker, we want more of it. And if something is brighter, we want less of it. So what this does is it makes dark things brighter and bright things darker. Right? By doing that, not only do we change the image and make it more neutral, more flat by making dark things brighter and bright things darker, not only are we doing this is kind of a byproduct, we're telling the computer we want more data, we want more information about what's going on in the darker parts of our image, and we want less information about what's going on in the brighter parts of our image. Now, if you think about this in like a logical sense, it kind of makes sense why we're doing this. Really bright things are just fucking bright, and there's not that much color information in them. Bright things are bright. The darker you get, the more variation in color and hues and gradients that you can actually see. Does that make sense? So we want more information in the darker parts of our image and less information in the brighter parts of our image. So not only do log footage has this byproduct of looking kind of flat and shitty, right? It actually has more data physically behind each pixel. There's more information that we're storing in our image. So log. So So what ends up happening is by doing this process, we can then insert a human being in between the log footage and the finished footage to bring out all of that color that we're storing in that extra data. So this part is log, right? And this is what the colorist has done to that footage, right? If you go look at people's color reels, right? I could send you a Ryan Urzi's color grading reel. You'll see these like swipes that come across the screen. They're swapping between the log footage and the colored footage. Does that make sense? So whenever you're on set and they say, okay, we're going to shoot an S log, this is what they're talking about. We're going to shoot this shitty image because we're going to insert a human being to make this beautiful image later. Does that make sense? Now, this is log footage. Here's an important thing that tricks up a lot of people. Remember that I mentioned there was 2 ways of doing this? The other option is instead of debayering, so this whole logarithmic thing that I'm talking about happens in this computer stage right here, by the way. Right? It's reading in all of this light data, and then it's interpreting that light data based on a logarithmic curve. But there's another option. Instead of doing this whole shenanigans, if you just didn't what if you just didn't debayer? What if you didn't do any of this at all? And what if we just took this electrical voltage and we just stored that on our flash cards, on our SD cards? Right? And if we did that, we would have what's called raw footage, which is the raw. I'm going to do it down here. If you just take the electrical voltage that's coming out of your sensor, voltage, and you just send this straight to storage, you have captured raw media. Now, here's why people suck. This is raw media. But everybody in this industry also calls log raw. It's a fucking pain. So if somebody says, get the raw footage, get the raw media, we're shooting in raw, you gotta actually figure out what they're talking about. Are they talking about electrical data, or are they talking about log footage? And it gets even more complicated when ARRI is a piece of shit and they call ARRI raw. They call their shit ARRI raw, and it's just log. So it's a fucking nightmare, right? Welcome to post. It's a pain. So when somebody says go relink to the raw footage, they're not speaking English, and you have to decipher what they're actually saying. Okay, have I made sense so far? Okay. One more thing here that I want to touch on. Anybody ever heard of a LUT?
It's like, or go for it, whoever.
No, what is a LUT?
Isn't it like, it's like a certain pattern of like coloring that you like put onto a footage or something?
Anybody know what LUT stands for? Stands for look up table. A LUT is literally a giant spreadsheet, and I mean this literally. It is a giant spreadsheet that tells you what pixel color. So if a pixel is red, what color it should be turned into. Maybe it's, in our sense, blue. Oh, I guess I should talk about what a pixel is. Hey, do you guys know what a pixel is? No? I'm taking the silence as a no. Okay, we're going to talk about pixels really quick then. Okay. A pixel is, if you look into your computer's screen is made up of pixels. Right? Oh, shit, there's more shit I got to talk about here. Fuck. I was like, oh, I'm almost done with color. I'm not almost done with color. A pixel is, in the modern sense, anybody ever heard the term LCD? Right. Anybody know what an LCD stands for? I'll tell you. Don't worry about it. Stands for liquid crystal display. And that's because a pixel is actually all of these crushed up, I'm going to sound like a fucking crazy person. It's all of these like crushed up crystals jam-packed into a tiny little space. And when you run an electrical current through it, you change how opaque those crystals are. This sounds like magic. It's not. But basically what ends up happening is you have this red crystal, you have this green crystal. Sorry, I said green and then wrote blue. You have a green crystal and you have a blue crystal. And behind this whole thing, if I were to draw a pixel on its side, behind this whole thing is a little LED. And depending on the electrical signal that I run through the crystals, I can make the red, green, and blue more opaque or less opaque. And then the light underneath it, when I shine that light through, I can create any color. Does that make sense? That might not make sense. Just know you have these little tiny red, green, and blue windows. I'm making the windows darker or brighter. And by shining a light through those windows, I can get different colors. Okay? So in a given image, like a 1920 by 1080, we've all heard that before, right? The term 1920 by 1080 means 1,920 pixels by 1,080 pixels. So when you have an HD 1920 by 1080 display, that's how many pixels you can show. And if your image is 1920 by 1080, that's how many pixels are in your image. Does that make sense? Now, there's a whole lot of science to talk about OLEDs. I'm sure there's LCDs is one type of display. There's also OLEDs. There's also CRTs. There's all these various ways of display technology. I don't really want to get into it right now. We might talk about it at the end if we have time. But a lookup table turns one pixel color into another pixel color. So if I have a pixel that is red, my lookup table might turn that blue. So a lookup table is a big spreadsheet that tells you what colors a pixel should turn into. Following along, everybody? Any questions? I'm totally fine if you have questions. I want to answer questions if there are any. Parker, you good? Okay. Okay, so a lookup table basically is a way of turning log footage into colored footage very quickly, right? So if you've ever been on set and you go to tap, you're looking at a nice image normally. It looks pretty nice, right? Everyone can agree? Looks pretty good. It looks good because they're putting a LUT on that display. So in actuality, the camera is capturing this shitty car, but it's showing you this really nice looking car, right? Because of the LUT. Now, because we put it on tap, it's not actually making that adjustment to the footage, right? The footage should be coming in like this. And when you edit with it and use it in Resolve or Avid or Premiere, or whatever, it's going to look like this. It's not going to look like this normally, unless you apply a LUT in Premiere, Avid, or Resolve, whatever, to that footage, right? Now there are standard LUTs. There's people will try to sell you on LUTs all damn day. They'll try to tell you that their LUT is better than whoever's LUT. People try to like copyright LUTs. Insane people. Every camera manufacturer has a default LUT that they recommend using. So if you're shooting on Red, Red has a series of LUTs that you should be using. Ari has a series of LUTs that you should be using. Sony has a series of LUTs you should be using. Panavision has a series of LUTs you should be using. So normally you want to use the camera manufacturer's LUT. Now, this is Dodge. In the real world, normally a DP and a director will meet with a colorist beforehand, and they will design a LUT for their movie or their television show that they like, and then they'll use that LUT on set instead of the camera manufacturer LUT. And that LUT is called the show LUT. So you'll hear that term a lot. That term is really important. Throw the show LUT on this. The LUT is the LUT that was designed beforehand. Sometimes the camera manufacturer LUT is the show LUT. This is like cheaper productions that don't have as much money or time. They're going to use the camera manufacturer LUT as the show LUT. But in general, for really high-end productions, or even just like moderate level productions nowadays, you design a show LUT beforehand. Am I making sense so far? Another quick little tangent. There's two types of LUTs. There's 2D LUTs and there's 3D LUTs. No one uses 2D LUTs anymore. The only difference is a 2D LUT only adjusts color, while a 3D LUT also adjusts brightness. Nobody uses 2D LUTs anymore. They're basically dead. They're for like very technical things. They're not really that used at all for modern things. Grant, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, hello. Any questions? Sorry, I keep asking for questions because sometimes this can just get really heady. Ah, shit. We've talked about all that. We talked about log. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, this is going to take a hot second to explain, but this is where people start to get really confused and why I feel like people are here. Everybody wants to know about color spaces. What's a good one? Can I find a good chart? I hate that chart. I have preferences, you know. That's fine. Anybody have any idea what this chart is? Anyone know? Grant, I know you know. You watched the video.
Yeah.
What is it?
I forget exactly what it's called, but it graphs out like what the eye can see, what like real life color is, and what different like monitors can display, right?
Yeah. So this right here, this little curve. Wow, God, I'm the worst illustrator in the world. This chart represents every color the human eye can see. Now, this actual physical color representation is not actually those colors. It's just like a helpful guide to basically say, this point is the reddest red, this point is the greenest green, and this point is the purplest purple, and this point is the bluest blue. Fun thing, purple doesn't actually exist. That's a really fun story from another time, but purple doesn't exist. It's fake. It's a psychological effect of your mind, not a real color. We can talk about that later, though. This chart is called CIE 1931, and that's because it was made in 1931, which is crazy, right? Crazy. But these little, you see these little triangles here, right? Everyone sees these little triangles? These triangles represent what we call display color spaces. And light, again, is an organic process. It's not really that much of a like very hard science type deal. But computers are a hard science. So computers need reference points for what the reddest red is, what the bluest blue is, and what the greenest green is. That display. So now I'm not talking about computers. Sorry, I'm talking about monitors. I'm talking about displays. I'm talking about theater projection, monitors, phones, displays. Displays need the greenest green that you can have, the reddest red, the bluest blue, and then also what we define as white, because there's lots of different points on this graph that you could call white. So we need a point to call white. So the most common of which if you're in Scott's class, you'll know, is Rec 709. Melissa, you've heard of Rec 709? Parker, you've heard of Rec 709? Sure. Eve, have you heard of Rec 709? You're going to hear this term a lot. You're never going to stop hearing this term, probably till the day you die. Rec 709 is the display standard for every single display on the planet. Now, what does that mean? What that means is this triangle right here is Rec 709. Right? And you can see in the little chart up there, sometimes it's referred to as BT 709. There's lots of different terms for it. It's the standard for HD television in the world. And it basically means that if you are an HD display maker, your LG, your Samsung, your Apple, your whatever, if you're making a display, at the bare minimum, your display needs to be able to display the colors in this triangle. And it should be calibrated, ideally, to only show the colors in this triangle. Right? What ends up happening is display manufacturers suck. And so although Rec 709 is what it should be, let's say Panasonic makes a display and they call it Rec 709, but in reality, their triangle looks something like, I shouldn't be using purple for this, I apologize. But let's say their triangle looks something like that. It's a little bit off, right? And then LG makes a display and it's right there. Like everyone could have these like not perfectly aligned with Rec 709. So we get into this problem of, okay, everyone's displays are different. So Rec 709 is just going to be our de facto standard, right? Shoot for Rec 709, do the best job that you can. So Rec 709 becomes just the basic display output for everything in the world. Now, there are new standards that are on the horizon. My iPad that I'm talking to you all on is a DCI P3. It's this one right here and is this larger triangle on the outside here, right? Does anybody have an iPhone 11 or an iPhone 12? Is iPhone 12 out? I don't know. Anybody have an iPhone XS, 10s? Gosh, we're all poor here.
Android for life.
Does anyone, no one has a projector. Anyone have I don't think the new MacBooks are DC. Anyone have a new MacBook? Like a brand new one?
I do.
That should be DCI P3. So that's the expanded color space. So the next industry standard is DCI P3. And then this big one that you see on the outside, which is Rec 2020 or BT 2020, is the biggest color space hypothetically imaginable on a display. No one in the world has manufactured a Rec 2020 display yet. They do not exist. But Who knows? Maybe in 20 years, right? So this is a display color space, and so this is how we see color on a monitor. When you record footage from a camera, cameras also have a camera color space. So they can also capture color, and when they debayer the footage into log or to not log, like an iPhone, something like that, they also have their own color space that they're working with. That's just important to know in general, that there's display color spaces like Rec 709, and there's also camera color spaces. The most, and camera color spaces aren't that really important for what you have to do, but it's just important to know that there are two separate things. So in general, footage that is log or footage that is raw or footage that is behind the scenes is called scene referred media. And footage that is meant to be viewed by the viewing public is called display referred. I just want to put that out because sometimes you'll hear those terms as well. We need to get the scene referred media for this. We need to get the display referred media out for this. Some shit like that. That's color spaces. So LUTs in general as well. Remember I mentioned they're like these spreadsheets. LUTs also generally are LUTs that are like, okay, so if we go shoot on a Sony, so let me give you an example of a scenario. I'm going to go shoot on a Sony camera, right? So on the F5, which we have at Dodge, I'm going to go shoot on a Sony camera, and I'm going to shoot in S-Log, right? The LUT that I'm going to use is Sony's S-Log to Rec 709.LUT, or it's actually normally .cube. Shit. So this is the name of the file that is the LUT. And it's basically a spreadsheet that's going to turn colors from S-Log to Rec 709. Did I just speak English? Did everybody understand what I said? Yes? Are we vibing? Yeah, I'm still recording this lecture. Oh, God, Scott's going to hate me.
You're doing great.
Thank you. This is like 3 hours long. Hopefully I didn't say anything terrible. I haven't said anything terrible, right?
Oh, you're fine.
Edit out of this. Okay.
I promise you're okay.
Let me know if I'm going to get canceled for releasing my post-production lecture. S-Log to Rec 709. This is like what a LUT file looks like. It's normally like .cube. There's a couple other extensions, but it's normally like .cube. And so this is going to do your adjustment from this to this. So if you're ever asked to put something on your dailies, we want to see the LUT on this, you need to go and like download S-Log to Rec 709.cube, and then in the LUT area, you upload this file, and it will do all that LUT transformation for you. Now, here's the other thing about Rec 709. When you make stuff in a Rec 709, a consequence of that is you destroy all of the unused data in the footage, right? So even though you just made it look beautiful, there's all of that data that's hiding behind each pixel, all that light information. And when we do this transformation, we end up throwing all of that away. Now, the reason we do that is it gets our file size down, right? And it makes stuff more readily able to play back and do all of these things. But a consequence of that is if you do your LUT too early in a color grade, right? Or let's say you're like, I don't need this raw media anymore. I'm just going to put the LUT on and I'm going to delete all my raw media. You're going to delete a ton of data, right? So LUTs are great, but LUTs are, in all essence of the words, always a final step. Now, they can be used at many different steps, but you never want to what's called bake a LUT in before you're ready, right? So there are some times that people will make dailies and they'll put the LUT on and then they'll delete the camera media because they think they don't need it anymore and it's taking up a bunch of space and they've totally fucked themselves. Right? So how color grading works and the process of that is a lecture for another time, but just follow me along here that there is the, I don't even actually know what these are called, but I'm going to call this the pre-color grading. The color grade. And the post-color grade. Now, there's a lot of history to go along with color grading, and I would love to talk about it, but we'd be here for another hour and a half, right? We can save that for another time. But suffice to say, the last step of your post-color grade should be applying the LUT. But here's the hard part. It's the first step you do when color grading. So it's the last physical process that happens to your media. This is a timeline in the computer of how to interpret your media. And the post-color grade should always be the final thing in this timeline. Does that make sense? Because if we're going to throw out all of that data, we want it to be the last thing that happens. But when we start sitting down to color grade, we put the LUT on at the end of the timeline, but then we do all of our color work here. We do a bunch of color. And so whenever you're sitting with a colorist or you see people sitting with a colorist, they're working largely in this window here. This pre-color grade is for like technical things that you might need to do to the footage for whatever reason, right? Like technical transformations or whatever. It's too much to talk about right now. But color grade, this little middle window is like the fun color grading stuff you think about, but you put your LUT on first, but you put it on at the end. Does that make sense? It's kind of a hard concept to understand without opening up Resolve. So this might be in the thing for another time, but just know that this is kind of how the process works. Let's talk about files, which is really exciting. So this is the total pivot, but you just have to go with me. We're talking about files now. Does anybody know what a format is? Anyone? Anybody know what a codec is? Parker, you made a face. I can't hear you. You're muted.
I literally just forgot. I just remember it was important. Wait. I don't know.
Okay, I'll explain.
Wait.
So when you capture stuff out of a camera, Eve, you've probably never seen this, so this might not make any sense to you, but everybody else should have seen this. So, you know, I'm shooting on set, I'm shooting on my Red or whatever, and they hand me the file, they hand me the SD, not the SD card, the mag. We call it mags, by the way, Eve. It's just a film term. It's the same thing as like an SD card. Call it a mag. So they hand me the mag, and on the mag has a bunch of files. So that file for the first day is going to look something like this. What's the date? Everyone's seen something like this, right? Eve, you've never seen anything like this, but this is what file names look like on cine cameras. So Reds, F5s, REs, they look like this, right? So let's break down this. This right here is in reference to the mag number. So remember how I told you that they hand you a mag, Eve? Well, every single time the camera operator hands you the SD card, the mag, the whatever, the card, and they put a new card into the camera, they're putting in a new mag into the camera. And so they increase the number. So this is the mag number. So the first mag of the day, the first mag of an entire shoot, sorry, of a whole film is going to be A001. The second mag will be A002, A003, and so on and so on. The A is in reference to the camera letter. So if you're shooting on a 2-camera shoot, the second camera will be B, the third camera will be C, the fourth camera will be D, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that letter never changes from the camera. On most shoots, and all the shoots at Dodge largely are 1-camera shoots, so they're all going to be A. But you have A001, A002 increasing. The C001 represents every single time that the start and stop record button was hit on the camera. So every single time I hit start record, I record C001. Every time I hit stop record, it increments it to C002. Every time I hit stop record, it increments it by 1. Normally, this is in reference to takes. Not always. Some directors like to shoot 4 takes in a single roll of the camera. So let's say camera's rolling, and that means we're recording. So sometimes they'll do 2 or 3 takes and a record. Generally pretty faux pas to do that. You generally want to stop recording every time you do a take. But this in general represents take. That's why I hesitate to say that this is the take number, because it's also like when they hit start and stop record. These 2 letters and numbers are random, generally. And then generally, this is some variation of the date. Now, when you record on a cine camera, this is the file name. And the file name is what you'll see in like Finder or Explorer or whatever on your computer. But cine cameras know that file names can be changed. I can change a file name. You can change a file name. We can all change a file name. So this data is really important for a lot of reasons. The A001, the C001. So we don't necessarily want this data to be able to get lost. So cine cameras have a foolproof thing that they build in. So this is the file name. But in the background of the file itself, right, it's also secretly, question mark, because it's secret, building what's called a real ID or a tape ID. And the real ID and the tape ID is just this whole thing right here without the R3D at the end. And you can't change a real ID or a tape ID without exceptional effort. So it's kind of a backup in case somebody fucks up and changes the file name. And it becomes really important later, which I'll talk about in a sec. But just know that we have this thing called real IDs and tape IDs, which is the same thing as the file name minus the little extension at the end, and we're hiding it in the camera, in the file. Now, .R3D, what is this? This is from a red camera, and 3 is an E backwards, so it's R3D. But there's lots of different types of extensions. There's MOVs, there's MXFs. Are there any more? Does anybody know any more? Like, I think these are the main 3 for professional cine. But what is an R3D? What is an MOV? What is an XMF? I'm sure you all heard of an MOV before. So let's talk about camera files really quick. A camera file is actually 2 parts. It is the format and it is the codec. Have people heard of these 2 terms before? Talk to me, anybody.
Definitely heard about it. Yeah.
You've heard about it before. Eve, have you heard about it?
I mean, I've heard the words, but I couldn't define them.
Sure, that's fine. Perfect, though. Glad you've heard it. Formats. You all know formats. A format is .mp4, .mov, .mxf. Give me some. I know you know them. Give me some formats. Hit me with them. Anybody? Like file extensions. That's okay. M2V. I'm trying to think of more fun ones. I think VLC has one, so there might be like .vlc.
Isn't there one that starts with an A, like a AAC or something like that?
Yeah, there is.
Audio.
ALC. There's a million, right? But yeah, so a format is all of these different extensions that you'll see at the. Oh yeah, R3D, obviously, who we were just talking about. But so if you think of a file, a video file, as a box, as like a little gift, the format is the outside of the box. It's what holds the contents of the box together, right? The codec is everything inside the box. Now, what does codec mean? Well, let's say I want to play. Yeah, Parker?
I just remembered the definition, I think, but
Go for it.
I don't know. Is it compression?
And
Decompression?
yes, it is compression, decompression. So anytime I want to play a video file, you can imagine it that I'm opening the box, right? And when I open the box, I need to read the contents of the box. Now, when I read the contents of the box, that's me watching the video file. When I close the video file, I need to then put everything that I've taken out, I need to put it back inside the box. This is where you get the term codec from, because it is short for compression, which is putting everything away in the box, and decompression, which is opening everything out of the box. So the codec is how a video file is stored, it's how it's played, it's how it's run, it's the meat of the potatoes, right? It's the actual contents of the file itself. Okay, I need to take a bathroom break. Give me 2 seconds. I will be back.
I like how our host just casually exited the chat.
How is everybody doing?
Having a grand old time. Feel bad. Michael gave me this whole like thing before like last year. This is like a nice little like reintroduction of all the ideas.
Pressure.
I feel like it's one of those things where it's like you have to like be interacting with these kind of things on a
Yeah,
daily
it
basis.
definitely makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
You have
What's up? Was it making sense?
Yeah. We were just
Am I
talking
putting puzzle
about,
pieces together?
yeah.
I like the page where you just write ugly all over it.
Ugly. It is ugly. Well, like digital raw is really ugly. Okay.
Mike, you gotta turn this into a PowerPoint. I didn't know like, you give this whole like presentation so often. You gotta have like slides prepared.
I think that's why Scott wants me to record it, so that when I'm gone, he can just play it for people. I know I give this lecture all the time.
I would be down to make a YouTube video with you. Just go through the whole thing.
I wanted to do this make it a whole YouTube video. I will one. Yeah, I'm down if you want to help me with it.
I think that'd be really like helpful and resourceful.
Yeah, I think so. If I can get off my lazy ass and do it. Codecs. Formats are great. MOVs, MP4s, MXFs, M2Vs, VLCs, R3Ds. These things are great. They really don't matter. right? Codecs matter so much more than formats. Now, formats are really important because there are formats, hypothetically, video format is a video format and a video codec is a video codec. You can mix and match them in different ways, right? But the people who make formats and the people who make codecs design them in mind for specific formats and specific codecs with one another, right? So it's best to play ball in the same court, if that makes sense. So for example, MOV is in reference to QuickTime. It's what they're called. They're called QuickTime files. QuickTime is made by Apple. So Apple formats are always going to work better with Apple codecs. In the same vein, MXF, multi-exchange format, is an open source, it's an open source video file, but it's predominantly dominated by a company called Avid, which we talked about earlier. And Avid formats work best with Avid codecs. Does that make sense? Now, there are some industry standards like H.264 is a codec that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. That's the default web codec. And that works best with MP4 and MOVs. So there are ones that work best with others, right? So if they're made by the same company, odds are you want to work in their playground, so to speak, right? You don't really want to be combining formats and codecs. You can, and people do, and you can, there's reasons to do it, but in general, play ball with the same team. But codecs. Codecs are probably the most, if you don't get anything from this lecture, this is the one thing that I would say you really should ask clarifying questions about this part, because it's probably the most important part. Because you'll never avoid this as long as you live in post-production. You'll never avoid codecs. In modern post-production, there are two types of codecs that people work with. There's a lot of codecs. Like I said, there's H.264, which is for web delivery. I guess, yeah. There's lots of different types of codecs that serve lots of different types of purposes. I'm not going to be talking about delivery codecs or delivery formats at all, really. That's a whole other ballpark of how that stuff works. I'm going to be talking about editorial codecs, of which there are two camps. There are ProRes codecs, and then there are DNX codecs. ProRes is made by Apple, as in Apple, iPhone, Apple, and DNX codecs are made by Avid. These are really the only important two to know as an editor. Another way to think about this is if you're working on a Mac, odds are you're going to be working with ProRes. If you're working on a PC, odds are you're working with DNX. They kind of split down that line. And this is because Apple has not updated QuickTime for Windows since like 2010. So they've like stopped support for QuickTime on Windows, which is why we had QuickTime removed from Dodge like 2 years ago, because QuickTime was seen as a security risk because it has not been updated. So it's like a backdoor for hackers. There are two types of codecs that we really care about in the world of editorial from these two companies. There are, I said I wasn't going to talk about delivery codecs, but I'm going to kind of talk about delivery codecs. There are finishing / delivery codecs. And then there are editorial codecs. Finishing and delivering codecs are codecs that are designed for what the name implies. They're designed for color, VFX, and in some cases, like viewing. But when I say viewing, I mean like you're going to a festival and they're playing it on a projector, not you're watching a YouTube video. Right? So finishing and delivery codecs are high in resolution. They're high in what's called bit rate. We'll talk about that in a sec. They're high in bit depth. They're also high. Oh, wow. I'm not spelling high correctly, guys. High, high, high. They're also high, most importantly, in file size. You realize that a lot of this industry is playing with file sizes. Editorial codecs are made for editorial. They're also meant for review. So if a producer is watching something, if a director is watching something, right, they're going to be watching it in an editorial codec. They are low res, low bit rate, low bit depth, and they are low file size. And both ProRes and both DNX have codecs in both camps. Okay. I'm going to talk about, normally I wouldn't talk about specifics, but I actually think this is really important because this is terminology that you will literally never get away from hearing. So it's better I just talk about it now. I'm going to talk about DNX. I'm going to talk about ProRes first because it's simpler. There are two codecs you really need to know. There is ProRes 422, and ProRes 422 has a lot of variations on it. There's ProRes 422 HQ, ProRes 422 Proxy, and they all have different properties about them. But just know that ProRes 422 is kind of like a little camp. And then there's also ProRes 4444. These are colloquially known as 422 and 444. So if somebody says we're shooting this in 422, or we're editing this in 422, or we are showing this to the producer in 422, or they say we're delivering in 444, we're shooting this in 444, this is what they're talking about. This is pretty important to know. I would memorize this if you haven't already memorized this, because the terms 422 and 444 will haunt you forever. On the vice, on the other camp, there's the DNX codecs. And here's the really annoying thing about DNX codecs. There's a lot of really irritating things about DNX codecs. There's actually two types of formats that work with DNX codecs. Remember how I mentioned MXF earlier? There's two types of MXF, or multi-exchange formats. There are MXF OP1As, which is a terrible name, and MXF OP Atoms, which is a much better name. The way that you can remember which one is which is atoms make up the building blocks of the universe. So in the same way, they make up the building blocks of editorial. So this is an editorial format, which also has editorial codecs in it, meant for editorial, while OP1A is a delivery format with delivery codecs. It's a terrible system. I'm apologizing because I told you, like, there's only codec, but it's just, you just need to know DNX is odd. Here's the real meat and potatoes. At Dodge, we deliver an OP1A. I don't know anywhere else in the industry where they deliver an OP1A. I've never run into a situation where any company I've ever worked for asked for an OP1A delivery. I've never been in a situation where we did OP1A delivery. Nobody delivers an OP1A. I would love to hear about the production that truthfully delivered their film finally in OP1A. Everybody delivers normally in ProRes 444 or in some type of theater delivery format like a DCP or a digital cinema projection, which is a whole other can of worms I don't want to open. But just know, basically nobody outside of Dodge uses OP1A, but you need to know how OP1A works because that's what we use at Dodge. And the reason we use OP1A and not ProRes 444 is because we had QuickTime uninstalled from all of our machines. Also, we're a PC school instead of a Mac school. So this is not that important, OP1A, but at Dodge it is. So take with that what you will. I want to talk about OP Atoms, because they're the only ones that actually do matter in the industry. For editorial, this is the standard for Mac-based editorial systems where they may or may not be using Avid. That being said, in the film and television world, it's not that common for a show to be edited in ProRes 422. On short form stuff, advertisements, music videos, yeah, you're going to see it a lot more often, ProRes 422. When I worked at Apple this summer, and when I worked at Apple, we worked in ProRes 422, right? I mean, not to say that like Apple wanted to use ProRes. I don't think Apple really cared, but like we used ProRes there, but it was like shorter form stuff. And when I worked on music videos and stuff, it's been in ProRes. That being said, most film and television don't work in ProRes 422. They work in something called I'm just going to say this, DNX HD 36. This is the standard for most people in the industry, although there's a lot of people now who work in DNX HD 175X. You'll hear that a lot too. I would say if you memorized anything, the thing to memorize is ProRes 422, ProRes 444, and DNX HD 36. Those are kind of the kingpins.
Michael, I have a clarification question.
Go for it.
So I understand for delivery why it would be important to deliver in a certain, format. If you're on Apple, you want to stay in ProRes for QuickTime, and if you're on PC, then you can use DNX. But when it comes to editorially, why does it matter what format you're in when programs like Premiere or DaVinci can work with any format on any kind of computer?
That's exactly what I'm going to talk about next.
Okay, cool.
I will get to that. I'll get to that question.
Okay.
So this is the foundational blocks. And at Dodge, we use DNX 36 HD, or DNX HD 36. Now, what do these numbers all mean? Is kind of a longer explanation. Let me pull it up.
Michael, every time you go to your homepage, it's a different photo of you thumbs up to the camera.
That's me pretending to be you.
What's that?
That's me pretending to be you, remember?
Oh, that's right.
That was me recreating. So there is a thing called the Avid White Paper, which, if I can find it, they want to email it to you. They never want to just like put it out online anymore, which is really irritating. God damn it. Can I just find it, please? Here it is. Yes, please take me to this. Here you go. So if you ask Avid, they'll actually email this whole document to you. So actually, before we do this, this is Apple's white paper. The only codecs that Apple has are these codecs. Minus ProRes RAW, which they just released recently, which you can read about in 2018, but that's a whole other thing. These are Apple's codecs, right? And they make it really, really simple, right? There's two camps to pick from, the 422 camp or the 444 camp, and then what flavor of 422 or 444 do you want? Does that make sense? Yes?
I think I'm still confused about what a codec actually, like, I get what you said a codec is, but like,
Okay.
what is it actually?
I might explain in a second here.
Okay.
Well, I'll explain it. So a codec is basically the rule set that a developer writes for how video files should behave, how they should be stored, how they should be viewed, and how much data we're going to put in them. So it's not like it's like a set of instructions. It's what we call like protocols. It's like a set of protocols for how to make a video file, what is in that video file, and how people are going to view that video file. Does that make sense? So it's not like it's a thing. It's not like this tangible thing. It's like a big list of instructions, right? It's code. Remember I showed you beautiful Apple's white sheet? Here's Avid's. It's a fucking nightmare. Avid has codecs for every single use case that you could ever need. Apple makes it very simple. Are you delivering or are you an editorial? Avid's like, we'll do whatever you want us to do. And remember how I said, so the codec is called DNX, but they put HR or HD, or is there another one? Yeah, they put HR or HD depending, and the number at the end, depending on a bunch of different factors. Now, I'm not going to go and explain every single one of these codecs, obviously. But what I'll tell you is if you look up the Avid white sheet, you can tell the difference between all of the different codecs and why they're different. So, for example, the one that is most used is 1080. Also, do you know the difference between interlaced and progressive? Progressive is what you use. Don't use interlaced. Done. So whenever you see 1080p versus 1080i, choose the P, not the I. Progressive. It basically means the image is flashing at you versus the old way of doing stuff, which is where you like scanned it and scan lines. It's interlaced is old. You don't need to know about it. Use progressive, use P, don't use I. So let's say, okay, we want to use 720p. No, yeah, we want to do, so let's say we want 1080p, 24 frames per second. Also, another thing, don't ever use 24, use 23.976. 24 is bad. If your DP is ever shooting in 24, go yell at them. If your DIT is ever transcoding at 24, go yell at them. 23.976 all the way through, all the time. This has to do with electrical currencies and things and how that relates to frame rate. It doesn't matter. 23.976, and for 30 frames per second, it's 29.97. This is just what we use. Cardinal rules, I'm telling you. Progressive, 23.976. Those are hard and fast rules. There's no playing with those. So, DNX HD 36, this is the key. This is the one that everybody uses. As you can see, it's 1920 by 1080. We're going to talk about chroma subsampling in a bit, which is what this is. Remember how I said ProRes 422? There's 422 for you, but we'll explain that in a second. Its bit depth is 8-bit. 23.976 is its frame rate. 36 is so when we say DNX HD 36, we're talking about its bit rate, The 36 is in reference to its bit rate. That's where you get your 36 from.
What is bit rate?
Say that again, Grant?
What is bit rate?
I'm going to talk about all three of these things in a second here.
Okay.
Because they're all really important. They each need their own little explanation. So Grant asked a really great question. There's 4 important aspects to a codec. There is resolution, which I think we all know. That's like 1920 by 1080. It's the pixel, how big are the pixels? There is the bit depth. There is the bit rate. And then there is the chroma, which is the hardest one to explain, so I'm going to leave it for the end. Anybody know binary? Does anybody know what binary is? Yeah, so binary is a way of counting numbers, and it's the hidden computer code to how computers work. Binary is on or off, also represented as a 0 or a 1. So let me write a binary number for you. That's a binary number. There's a lot of math to do with binary numbers, and it's not that important to understand. So just pretend I'm a cult leader and you're believing in everything I say. And just go with what I'm saying for right now. This is a binary number. Because there are 8 values here, we call this an 8-bit number. If I add two more bits, so either a 0 or a 1 is a bit. If I add 2 more bits, I get a 10-bit number. If I were to if I add 6 to that, I have a 16-bit number. And if I were to double that, I'd have a 32-bit number. Most computer systems today work off of 64-bit numbers. With your bit, I have a 64-bit operating system. And bits and binary can represent a lot of stuff, a ton of stuff. But in terms of what we need it to represent, which is codecs, they represent the depth of our color. So the more bits you have, the more color and variations in color and gradients and changes between color. So it's like I have a sunset and I'm shooting a sunset and I have all these different variations of the color in that sunset. In a 10-bit video file is going to be able to represent all of the subtle nuances. I almost said nuances. Nuances in that sunset versus an 8-bit number. Like I said, I'm a cult leader. Just take what I'm saying at face value. I don't know why that is, other than I know that when you have a 10-bit number, you can represent more numbers. So binary works, and counting in binary is a complicated thing, but suffice to say, this represents 0. This represents 1. And this represents 2. The way you count in binary takes a little bit of practice to get used to, but suffice to say, binary allows you to make these big numbers and represent and use those numbers to represent color values. So suffice to say, the bigger the number you have, the more color values you can represent, and thus the bigger color depth you can get in your image. And the more information you can pack in per pixel. Does that make sense?
So there's like, long story short, the more bit depth a video file has, the more color information it has.
Exactly. So for our purposes, DNx HD36, I'll put that over here, that is an 8-bit, which is pretty low. Now, the reason that's okay is because in editorial, we don't need beautiful color, right? We want to work with the smallest file sizes possible. So whatever data we can get rid of, we want to get rid of it. Everybody following me along?
And then part of the conforming process, do you conform it back to a higher bit depth video file for exporting?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll talk about conform in a second. Bit rate is the amount of data per sec. I think it's measured in seconds. It might be measured in frames. I don't remember. It's the amount of data per second in a video file. So it's literally how much data are we allocating to being used per frame or per second of footage, right? So on this white sheet, you'll see that we are allocating 36 megabits per second. So that's all you get per second, right? So the video codec needs to fit in all of the information it's going to fit in into 36 megabytes per second. So we're basically capping the size that a video file can be. Does that make sense? So my 1 second DNx HD36 file is going to be the exact same size as Grant's 1 second DNx HD36 file. And 36 megabits per second is pretty low, right? So same deal, we're trying to save on file size, and the smaller your file size is, by the way, and the less bit depth and the less bit rate and all of that, the easier it is for your computer to deal with it, which is why we use it in editorial. Everybody following along? The last thing is a thing that I hate explaining because I'm really bad at explaining it, but I'm going to try my best. There is a whole lot to be said about color compression. There's a lot to be said about it. But the simple and sweet of it is, do you remember what I was telling you about what matters more, cones or rods? What matters more?
Rods.
Rods. In the same vein that we are really, really sensitive to how bright things are, we're not so sensitive to color. So a trick of the trade is, if you, when doing video compression, throw out half of the color information, nobody can tell, right? That's just like a psychological fact in general. So there is a process in video codecs called YCBCR. So this is our image right here. This is our Y, this is our CB, and this is our CR. I don't know what those things stand for. It's just what they are. And you abbreviate this as YCBCR. Like I said, I am a cult leader. Just believe everything I'm saying. If you take YCBCR and break it down into numbers representing 0 as totally gone to 4 as 100% there, if we have an unaltered image that we've done no color compression or video compression to, right? Like, we're not trying to get the file size down. This is straight out of camera. We would represent these numbers as 444. Do you remember what I was saying earlier with ProRes? So Remember, this is our light. Yeah, Y is luminance. But I don't know what Y is luminance. That's what I was saying. It might be something on like the Y axis of like XYZ color, but that's unimportant. What ends up happening is if I take half of this color information and just throw it out, and same deal here. I'm not actually like when I cross these out, I'm not saying that we're getting rid of half of the image. I'm just saying like on a data level, I'm getting rid of half of the image. And I cut these numbers down in half. This is where we get ProRes 422 from. Does that make sense? Here's the other thing. You might be wondering, Michael, what the fuck are these things right here? Remember how I was like, you can take a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel and combine them to create an image? In the same way, you can take these specific color palettes and combine them along with a luminance layer, a black and white layer. You know, if you add all of these together, you get that. Okay. Any questions? So for DNX HD36, you abbreviate this as 422. Any questions?
When it comes to color grading, do you want to keep your chroma subsampling untouched, right? Or at least like keep it as high as possible because you're getting rid of color information?
So when I say getting rid of color, I mean like, yeah, but like people can't tell. I mean like in general, people can't tell. You
So,
still want to have that data when you're manipulating color. Yeah. That makes sense?
so is there a different standard for chroma subsampling when it comes to editorial and coloring, or do you tend to stay at just 432 all throughout?
When you go to color, I'm going to talk about conform in a second, but when you go to color, basically you're going to conform your 422 video files to 444 files.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so these are codecs. What Grant is talking about now is he's talking about like the editorial workflow. So remember I was saying, okay, we get these video files out of our camera, right? These video files, when they come out of the camera, are normally in a finishing codec. So let's say, for example, we're shooting, okay, and also Red is very different. Remember how I mentioned there's ProRes and DNX? Red has their own system for doing all of this. So R3D is Red's version, and then their codecs are different, and they do a bunch of different stuff. Nobody ever works with Red's formats and codecs. They just automatically convert them almost instantly to an Avid codec or a Apple codec, like immediately out of the gate, to work with. So we're going to talk about editorial now. How many of you know about proxy workflows? I think all of you but Eve should know about proxy workflows, right? Everybody, yes, no?
Just explain it one more time.
Okay, happy to explain it. So we have our camera, and our camera creates camera raw. I'm going to call it camera original media. And camera original media is going to be really, it's going to be a high it's going to be a finishing codec. So let's say, for example, we're going to get ProRes 444s out of our ARRI Alexa here, right? So we're going to get really high fidelity camera files out of our camera. We're going to get ProRes 444 quick times that are really, really nice, right? Well, we can't actually work with these in editorial. Technically we can, but we need really powerful hardware to do so, right? And so normally for almost everybody, what we want to do is we want to take this camera original media and we want to run this through a process called transcoding. And what we're going to do is we're going to create transcodes. And transcodes are going to be in an editorial codec. Let's say ProRes 422 or DNX HD 36. Now, Grant was asking why we would use one codec over another in reference to like editorial programs. Sorry, let me just check the time really quick. Okay, I got about an hour and a half left here before I got to go move. Grant was asking why we would use different codecs for different things. In the old days of like early software editor, Eve, you heard me refer to something earlier called an NLE. An NLE is a term for a professional editing software, of which in the old days there were two really. There was Avid and Final Cut Pro. This is why we have Avid codecs and Apple codecs, because Apple developed Final Cut Pro and Avid created Avid. Now it's called Media Composer. And in the old days, if you wanted to work on a Final Cut system, you had to use ProRes dailies. And if you wanted to work on an Avid editing system, you had to use DNX HD dailies. Does that make sense? Nowadays, almost every editing software accepts every other codec. So in the old days, it was like, if I'm an Apple boy and I'm editing on my Final Cut, I'm going to use ProRes 422. If I'm working on a PC system and I'm using an Avid, I'm going to use DNX HD 36. Nowadays, it's a lot more loosey-goose. But suffice to say, there are some major players in town in the editing game that are different than what it used to be. There are really two major players. There's a major league with two players in it, a minor league with one player in it, and a high school league, and everybody's looking at the high school league and seeing if they're going to move up to the minor leagues. So the major players are two programs, Media Composer, colloquially known as Avid, and what's the other one? You guys know it. You use it so much more than this one. Come on. Say it.
Premiere.
Premiere. Premiere Pro. These are the major leagues. I guess, you know what, in the minor leagues, I'll put Final Cut Pro X and DaVinci Resolve. The major leagues and the minor leagues.
You
All
put Final
of-
Cut 7 in major.
Huh?
Put Final Cut 7 in major.
Used to be, and then
Yeah.
Apple choked. Yeah, Final Cut 7 is a very famous editing application that like editors still use, which causes endless headaches for the poor AEs who have to support them.
Parasite was cut on Final Cut 7.
Yes, it was. Final Cut 7 is literally from like the early 2000s, and it only runs on really old versions of Mac. So you have to like find really old Mac hardware to even run it. It's a pain. So these are all NLEs, which stands for non-linear editors. And so it used to be, you know, in the old days, there was only two NLEs that really dominated the market, which was Avid and Final Cut. So you needed to work in Avid or Final Cut systems. Nowadays, all of these applications will accept almost all of the other competitors' codecs and formats and stuff. Why you use one editing application over the other is the source of endless debate. And everyone has a goddamn opinion. Everybody thinks they're right. I don't care. And none of you should care either. If anybody ever tries to tell you that Avid is the only way of doing things, they're wrong. If anyone, Grant, tries to tell you that DaVinci Resolve is the only way of doing things, they're wrong.
When did I ever say that? I like DaVinci and Premiere.
Yeah. If anyone, a lot of people will tell you that Premiere Pro is the only way to do things, they're wrong. Why one editing application is better than the other is a matter of personal preference and what your job requires. Don't ever become beholden to one editing application. Don't ever think that only one editing application is the way to go. And don't let some person try to tell you that. If you decide to go into editorial and AE work, you will consistently run into people who will tell you that Avid is the only thing that exists. And if you're not on Avid, you're not a real editor. And then people will tell you if you work on Avid, you're an old person and you should get with the times, old man. Like, there's benefits and negatives to all of these applications. I don't really want to go into those benefits and negatives right now because that will be a whole discussion in and of itself. But suffice to say, Avid is used for long form projects. Premiere is used for short form projects. That's generally the way these things cut out to be. Avid is used for film and television. Premiere is used for commercials, music videos. Right. This is the way these things work. Now, there's a ton of stuff to continue. Like I said, I'm giving you a very broad view of post-production right now. I know this seems like a ton of information, but it really is broad. There's a ton of stuff to learn about how like Avid storage works with Nexus, which is their storage system. You know, more stuff about color grading. There's a ton of stuff to continue going on, but I just don't have time. I'm also like already exhausted. So how teachers do this constantly day in, day out. I'm like, oh my God, crazy. Once we've made transcodes, we then need to sync up those transcodes with audio. Eve, I don't know if you know this yet, but on professional film sets, audio is recorded separately from the video, right? And so they need to be rejoined later. So after you take your transcodes, and you add audio to them. Once you've done this process, you've made dailies. So creating dailies is this process right here. This is also called proxies at this stage as well. Sometimes people will also call this transcodes, although I would argue that's a misnomer. Once you've edited the film with these proxies, with these dailies, whatever.
Wait, Michael, I don't know if you clarified it entirely. Do you want to explain like exactly what transcodes are and proxies in comparison to like camera footage?
Yeah, okay. Transcodes are taking a finishing codec like ProRes 444 at a high resolution like 4K and turning them into a shitty codec like ProRes 422 at 1080p. So we're basically downgrading and down-resing and down we're shitifying our footage so that it can be used in editorial in a much easier capacity. Does that make sense? Everybody, yeah? Once we've edited the film, so this is my editorial timeline that I've built out or whatever. So we've done all the fun. And here's what you see. All the stuff you learn in college about how to be an editor, I just skipped over all of that because that's right here. That's like how to be an editor is this tiny step right there. I'm skipping over it entirely. That's a whole career. I'm skipping over it all. I'm jumping straight to the next thing. Once you've finished editing the movie, you have a timeline. You have a timeline, right? And this timeline, again, is made up of this kind of garbage footage. That was my attempt at drawing poo. This is probably unimportant. That's my poo. Like, this footage is not very good. So do you remember earlier how I mentioned this thing? Right? Well, when we make dailies, people do lots of stuff to dailies. They rename them, they move them, they can really futz with them. So when we make transcodes, we're also going to move over the real ID as well. That's going to get baked into the transcodes as well. So now we go into the what seems very complicated at the outset, but I promise you it's not. The conform process. And it's really important to understand how this works. During the conform process, we're going to take our proxy files and our timeline made up of those proxy files, and we're going to move it to an application like DaVinci Resolve for color grading and for VFX output and a bunch of stuff. So this is our timeline editorial, and we want to move this to an application in which we can do color grading and VFX compositing and a bunch of stuff. We're going to call that finishing. The files that we want to then be moved here for our new timeline, we want them to be the exact same content of the prior files, but instead of using the proxy files, we want to use the camera originals. So we want the same frame from every single shot to be matched up exactly, but we want to be using a different file than what we were using before. Does that make sense? Yeah? So the way that we do this is by going back to a really old concept. Our good old friend, the editing decision list. So the way an EDL, and there's lots of variations on the EDL. There's the EDL, the XML, the XLE, the AAF. There's a lot of different variations on this, but the basic principle is all a timeline is, right, is a big text document. So this is what an old editing decision list looks like. I want what an EDL looks like. Beautiful. I promise this will make sense. This looks really intimidating. It's really not that bad. Okay. So when we're done with our editorial in Avid or Premiere, we output something that looks like this. Now this just looks like a crazy string, but I promise I will explain what it is. These numbers right here represent time code. How many of you know what time code is? So let me explain what time code is. So if I have a video file and it goes on for 10 seconds, the first frame of this video file, its time code is 0000000000. And if it goes on for, somebody give me a number and a frame count. How many minutes and how many frames? Somebody.
3 minutes, 13 frames,
How many seconds?
23 seconds.
Okay. So Grant said our video file is 3 minutes, 23 seconds, and 13 frames long. That is what its time code looks like. These are zeros, by the way. Does that make sense? So we can pull out any spot from here. Oh my God, it made it a square. How did I do that? That's crazy. Oh, that's... I can pull out any second in this timeline. Let's pull out 0, 1, 12, 0, 5. Right? And that's a different time code that I can pull out of there. Right? That's a different frame. So hypothetically, if I just cut a section of this clip out and I put that in my timeline, all I'm creating is a range of time code numbers for how long I want that clip to run. Right? So let's say I pull this second out and I'm going to run it from, this is the start of my cut, right? My cut starts right here and it runs until the end of the video file. That means the edit looks like this. That's the actual edit itself. Does that make sense? That's the time code that that clip is running from. Everybody following me along so far? Now, this is a clip's time code, but if I have a timeline, like an editing timeline, I can also have a time code for my editing timeline. So let's say my timeline is 10 minutes long. Right? And I want to slot this clip that I've just cut, I want to slot it right here in the middle. Right? I've now created 4 numbers, 4 time code numbers that represent an edit. Let's say this number, somebody give me a number. What does this number represent right here? Let's say it represents 8 minutes exactly. Okay, this little dot right here represents 8 minutes exactly. Well, if I'm starting it at 8 minutes and I'm running it for, how long is this? 2 minutes, 11 frames, or 11 seconds, and 8 frames. This edit runs until 0, 0, 10, 11, 0, 8. So let's say my timeline is 15 minutes long. So basically what ends up happening is I say, okay, I want to take this clip that I've edited right here, sorry, I'm gesturing with my hands, but I realize you can't see it. I'm going to take this clip that I've edited right here, and I'm going to drag it, and I'm going to start it at 8 minutes exactly, right? Because it's 2 minutes, 11 seconds, and 8 frames long, it's going to run from 8 minutes to 10 minutes, 11 seconds, 8 frames. Does that make sense? So I have created 4 numbers. I have created a time code number for the beginning of my clip to the end of my clip, and I've created time code numbers from where it starts in the timeline to where it ends in the timeline. Gosh, it's so thick. Does that make sense? So on this EDL, if you'll see, there are 4 time code numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And those represent exactly the numbers of what I'm talking about. When the clip starts, when the clip ends, where to start it in the timeline, and where to end it in the timeline. So you'll see, let's see if I can find it. This is where the clip ends in the timeline, right? So this is where the clip ends in the timeline. And then look, it's the exact same number a line later because that's where the clip starts in the timeline, right? That number goes right there. These numbers basically just move diagonally because it's the start and stop position keeps just shifting down. Did we lose Melissa? Oh, nah. Okay, does that make sense? So we take this EDL and basically, this is a long way of saying we take this EDL and when we make the EDL, we can put lots of different information in the EDL. This is a really basic one, but you can actually put a lot of information in an EDL. And so the information we're going to put into the EDL is that tape ID, that real ID that we've made earlier. So by putting the real ID in, we can then tell our editing application to, instead of using the proxy footage, use the camera original footage from earlier. Because they're both going to share the exact same real ID. So the editing system doesn't, we're kind of tricking the editing system into using different files than what it was using before. This process is also called relinking, which is a part of the conforming process. It's not, relinking is not conform in and of itself, but relinking is part of conform. That all making sense? Any questions? Parker, Grant?
Got it.
Molto bene. Once you get it into a finishing application like Resolve, that's where you start the process of like sending VFX out to people, right? So that's a whole thing I don't really want to get into, but basically suffice to say for VFX, you don't use video files, you use what are called image sequences, which are DPX or EXRs, which do come in handy later, but you don't really need to know about those right now. But basically suffice to say, when you hand over visual effects, you hand over DPX sequences, not video files. So you have to make those in Resolve. Grant, is there anything I'm missing that I need to talk about?
I don't think so. I think that's about covers it.
ProRes 444 is going to have a chroma subsampling of 444. But they add another 4 on, I don't know why. It's 44444, but everyone calls it 444. Just deal with it. Any questions that anybody has about anything? It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. It's always important to remember that Dodge's post workflow is emblematic of the real industry, but it is not the industry workflow. Everybody does stuff differently. Every show does stuff differently. So when you're an AE on any given show, it's really important to basically find out how they're doing stuff differently. This is a very generic view of post workflows. But again, the thing to remember is DNxHD 36 for your editorial. When you're making your transcodes, and make sure the real ID is in there. And the post-production guide on Project HQ walks you through doing all of this stuff. Make sure the real ID is in there. And have fun. And that's really it. Those are like the big takeaways that I would say you really need to come away with. We talked about color spaces. We talked about markup tables. We talked about raw. Yeah, I'm pretty confident about all of that. Sorry, it just came to such an abrupt halt. I don't have much else to say. I'm trying to think what else needs to be said. You'll learn, most of you have learned or will learn, or it doesn't matter, learning about like the different sizes of camera sensors and how those affect images, but that's like cinematography. And I am not qualified to talk about cinematography in an instructional capability. But like I said, Eve, I mean, I told you, I think being a great editor nowadays really requires being a good colorist. So learning how, or being a great AE really requires being a good colorist. So learning how Resolve works, I would say if you have like the time and the energy, you should try to color some IPs or anything like that and just get your hands dirty with doing this conform, getting it into Resolve, and then trying to make it look as good as you can. Oh, is this the Captain Disillusion video? Oh yeah, and then after this, everybody has to go watch this video. This is like homework. It's not like homework, oh, do this whenever. Right when you hang up this call, go watch this video that Grant has just put in the chat. The first thing you do when you hang up is you should go watch this video.
It does a great job of just visualizing like everything.
There's so much I glossed over because Captain Disillusion does such a good job of talking about it that he's made it totally useless for me to try to explain. Genuinely. Okay, that's everything you need to know. Largely. Oh, last thing. I want to talk about red only because I wasn't going to talk about it, but now I talk about it because it applies to Dodge. Red has a thing called IPP2, which stands for Image Processing Pipeline, which Eve, Parker, Grant, you all will run into or have already run into. But IPP2 is a different way of doing log, like we talked about earlier. It's like a different way of encoding log. So the answer to how do Michael, I have this IPP2 footage, how do I deal with it is Google it. The workflow of how IPP2 works is just very much press this button and then press this button and then press this button. I genuinely don't know or actually give a shit about what IPP2 is or why they do it. You just need to Google how to deal with it.
Fred
So
has like IPP2 to like Rec 709 like conversion stuff that you can download and then throw into your timeline or like Resolve project to
just Google it. Just Google it because it's fucking dumb and I hate it, but it is what it is. So you just have to deal with it. And normally I'd be like, oh, this is like such a specific use case that I probably wouldn't talk about it. But all of our new Reds at Dodge shoot on IPP2. So it's just important to know that this is something you'll run into and have to deal with. Yeah, that's everything.
Thank you so much for like taking the time to do this. This has been so helpful.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. If you have any questions or you run into anything, please text me, email me. Yeah, I'm happy to help. Eve, do you have my number?
I don't think so.
Thank you, Michael. I have to
You're
go.
welcome,
But
Bye-bye.
thank you. Goodbye.
That's my number.
Okay,
Text
thank
me.
you.
Yeah, text me so I have your number, and then just text me if you ever have any questions. But also, Facebook Messenger is one of the best ways to get a hold of me.
Oh wait, can I see it really quickly?
Oh,
Sorry. Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Grant. Any other things that I need to talk about? If you have any other things that last chance for me to talk about anything.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of this will make a lot more sense and be more once you're going through the actual editorial process. Like I know for me, the hardest thing is just remembering vocab words and what's associated with what. But like once you're actually going through the process and you'll see like the words in Resolve and like, oh, I remember that word. Then it's like you can reiterate to what Michael's talking about here, and then you can piece it all together. So, but I think he pretty much covered everything. Very good.
Okay, I'm going to. What's the best way? I'm going to email this to you, Eve. Grant, do you want this as well?
Sure.
All right, I will email this to you guys. All right, guys. That's all I had to say. I got to go move.
Look.
Exhausting. All right. Huh?
Get some caffeine.
Yeah, I had some McDonald's tea earlier, which I really enjoyed, that hot tea. But I might go get some coffee before I drive up to Englewood.
Found a place?
I didn't tell you?
No, you didn't.
Oh, yeah, I found a place. You'll have to come up. Come see the place. It's kind of like, it needs some work.
That's okay.
Like my master bedroom smells like cigarettes a little bit, which is horrible. So I have to go clean. Clean everything. And we have like ants, so we have to get ant traps going. And there's no AC, which our landlord let us know after we signed the lease, even though he told us there was. So that's fun. So we have to go buy portable AC units, and I need to go buy furniture.
Well, you got projects now to work on.
Yep. Yep, I do. Yes, I do. All right. Okay, I'm gonna go.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Anytime. All right, bye guys.
All right, see ya.
Oh, let me end my record.